Okay, good evening. Tonight we can continue with the theme of the five Khandas, and I wanted to just do a little bit of reading from the Teachings of Ajaan Pannavaddho. He was one of the great disciples of Longta Mahabua, and he has some really quite very clear and quite wonderful teachings on the Khandas in his biography that was done. So I'll just begin with a section on feeling, and then I will read a section on memory. Craving is the root cause of attachment. Because of that, to free your mind of attachment, you must go directly to tanha, or craving, and eliminate that. If you overcome craving, you'll overcome attachments. But you cannot deal with the attachments directly. Trying to overcome attachments by sheer determination or willpower won't work. The only way to overcome attachments is to get rid of their cause, which is craving. This is stated clearly in Paticcasamuppada, or dependent origination. Dependent on feeling, craving arises. Dependent on craving, attachment arises. Craving being the condition for attachment, when craving is destroyed, attachment cannot arise. Because craving is dependent on feeling, when you aim to destroy craving, you have to first focus your attention on feeling. This is a critical point because exactly at the juncture between feeling and craving, you can place a barrier. Feeling is just feeling. It is a result of past karma, whereas the tanha is new karma. So by allowing the two to link up, you are creating more karma. If you can turn away at that juncture and prevent that new karma from occurring, the situation gradually improves. But Paticcasamuppada does not give practical guidance on how to do that. It reveals how the process unfolds, but it does not indicate the way to unravel the entanglement. In order to unravel it, you must learn to find the feeling. Examine feeling and see how feeling gives rise to tanha. Paticcasamuppada is an account of the sequence of causes that condition the arising of suffering and, in reverse order, the cessation of suffering. The Buddha's purpose in teaching dependent origination was to point out the general pattern of conditions that causes beings to wander endlessly in samsara, and to show how that causal sequence can be brought to an end. The Buddha emphasized that he was able to attain enlightenment because he was able to bring dependent origination to an end within his own mind. Because Paticcasamuppada is a realization that the Buddha came to on the night he gained enlightenment, as a teaching, it can be difficult to clearly comprehend. For that reason, the conditional factors of Paticcasamuppada should be used as meditation subjects with considerable caution. The Buddha laid out a practical teaching. For example, Paticcasamuppada explains the process of what happens to create dukkha, but it does not give the method of how to cure dukkha. In order to discover the method for curing dukkha, you must practice the Noble Eightfold Path until you understand the Four Noble Truths. That notwithstanding, a basic understanding of the process laid out by Paticcasamuppada can help quite a lot in meditation practice. It details a process that can be understood at different levels of subtlety. Due to those subtleties, the factors of Paticcasamuppada are difficult to interpret using conventional language. My understanding of them goes something like this. Avijja paccaya sankhara means avijja is the fundamental ignorance within oneself, a cloud of delusion which is extremely deep and all-pervasive. Ignorance produces the karma that leads to all the conditions for birth. Dependent on the existence of those conditions, or sankharas, vijnana arises. Those first three factors, avijja, sankhara, and vijnana, are not dependent on physical human existence. They are most certainly mental states. The vijnana factor in paticca-samuppada is always referred to as patisandhi vijnana. This is not the normal type of vijnana that we refer to as consciousness. Rather, it is the relinking consciousness that connects one birth to the next. That relinking consciousness forms the connection between past and future, which leads to grasping at the moment of conception. Patisandhi vijnana is said to be free of doors, that is, free of the sense doors. To understand patisandhi vijnana, you should put aside the word consciousness, which can be quite a misleading translation. My understanding of the word vijnana in this context is that the prefix vi, meaning divided, is combined with jnana, meaning knowledge. In other words, divided knowing. The one mind splits into two, subject and object, and instead of being pure, unlimited knowing, the mind is driven by avijja plus kamma to discriminate so that it becomes this, knowing that. A duality is thus established in which the this becomes nama and the that becomes rupa. Thus, vijnana is the condition for the arising of nama-rupa. Although avijja, sankhara, and vijnana are conditioning factors, those factors all arise simultaneous to the split into duality. No time interval is involved. It's like a railway engine pulling a train. The engine is the cause, but none of the cars move independently. So vijnana is a condition for nama-rupa to arise. Nama-rupa is a difficult factor to interpret. Nama literally means name. In other words, putting names to things, designating and defining. And rupa is the form, that is, the thing that we make concrete with the name. When we make forms concrete with names, we divide them out from the whole. Looking at the forest, we see leaves, trees, and flowers. We call them leaves, trees, and flowers merely to define certain aspects of what we see. But they are only our aspects. They do not exist as such there in the forest. The forest itself is one whole. It is we who differentiate the various aspects. In reality, our perceptions do not exist as separate entities at all. We separate the forest into various parts so that we can bring some order to our perceptions. This is how nama-rupa works. It is the dividing out of certain aspects of our perceptions of nature which accord with the previous sankharas. In other words, we are defining our world according to our own past tendencies. So we create a world in the present based on data from the past. This loops back to avijja, paccaya, sankhara, with sankhara being the karmic conditions from the past that determine rebirth. Nama-rupa in turn conditions salayatana, which is the breaking forth of the sense fields. The senses are the fields of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, with the mind as the field of cognition. It is not so much that the senses are faculties we acquire, but rather that the senses are productive faculties. The sense fields produce sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and tactile sensations as internal phenomena, which means they are very actively involved in generating those sensations. In the paticca-samuppada formula, salayatana conditions phassa, or sense contact. The sense fields allow contact between sense objects and their corresponding sense bases. So the sense bases are a precondition for contact to occur between the mind and its perceptions. Phassa gives rise to vedana, that is, sense contact conditions the arising of feeling. In the context of paticca-samuppada, the arising of feeling is a resultant process that is caused by consequences of actions done in the past, coming up in the present. The feeling may be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Feeling is a condition for tanha, or craving, to arise. Based on feeling, a personal, emotional judgment is made as to whether a feeling is considered pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, which leads directly to a craving for the pleasant, an aversion for the unpleasant, and a dull indifference toward the neutral. In other words, there is a tendency to react with either greed, aversion, or delusion. These reactions are all aspects of the kilesas, with feeling as their condition. Feeling arises, and then the kilesas arise. For example, you hear a sound you don't like. Based on that sensation, an unpleasant feeling arises. That unpleasant feeling is a feeling of aversion. Thus, aversion arises dependent on circumstances. Feeling is experienced first, and if we don't like it, that feeling then brings up aversion. Because that feeling is dukkha, a desire to suppress it arises. The tendency then is to search for scapegoats. You try to find something like another person or a sound or the heat or whatever. You straight away blame something like that for the unpleasant feeling. Then the anger goes out to that. This reaction is quite wrong because that anger generates a lot of thought, and that thought is kamma. That kamma will revert back to you later and produce the feeling again. But the feeling of aversion isn't the emotion of aversion. There's no aversion in feeling. It becomes aversion when you start thinking, criticizing, blaming, and so on. That's where the trouble comes, in the thinking. Feeling is a result of the past, but when you think, that thinking is kamma. So it's the thoughts that keep the anger going. It's there in paticca samuppada, dependent on phassa, the contact of sensation, feeling arises. Dependent on the arising of feeling, craving arises. So the craving comes dependent on feeling. But the feeling is a result of the past, so it's just something you have to put up with. Whereas thought is tanha, the craving to get rid of that unpleasant feeling, which is the making of new kamma. Tanha has two aspects, craving to have pleasant feelings and craving not to have unpleasant feelings. Craving in turn gives rise to either attachment to pleasant experiences or distaste for unpleasant ones, which is the reverse side of attachment. Because of habitual emotional patterns, we usually get caught by feeling when it arises, and immediately up comes tanha, the craving. The only way to overcome that is to learn the method of going inward to investigate feeling. Suppose in the past you have been angry, and that anger triggers the arising of feeling in the present. That feeling is a feeling of imbalance. Your mind is out of balance. Feeling out of balance, you try to restore a sense of equilibrium within. If the cause is anger, the habitual response is to blame something or someone. If the cause is greed, the response is to go out searching for sense gratification. These are the normal ways that the kilesas seek balance. Instead of restoring equilibrium, the kilesas become the causes of more defiled actions. When those actions bring results, the consequences of those actions then act as fertile ground for more defilements. In other words, seeking balance in defiled actions creates more kamma, which only makes the imbalance worse, because the consequences rebound back to you later on. In this way, the round of rebirths continues to revolve without end. As long as ignorance and defilements are calling the shots, kamma will continue to bring results and suffering will continue to accumulate. Only when ignorance and craving are destroyed will the chain of dependent origination be broken and the end of suffering be reached. To summarize in reverse order, attachment depends on craving, craving depends on feeling, feeling depends on sense contact depends on having the sense bases, which in turn depends on having mind and body. Mind and body depend on vijnana, the consciousness without doors, which arises due to the ignorance that produced the kamma, leading to all the conditions for birth, aging, sickness, and death. The point where we can have the greatest impact in breaking this cycle of birth and death is at the nexus between feeling, craving, and attachment. It is there that we can start unraveling paticca samuppada. Feeling is a critical link in the chain of dependent origination, because it is between feeling and craving that you can erect a barrier to prevent the evolution of the process. It's at this juncture between feeling and craving that we have an option to either accept or reject the kilesas. Craving's reaction to the arising of feeling is not predetermined. The arising of feeling simply means that the conditions are present for activating the kilesas. Whether the kilesas spring into action at that point or not depends on our state of mind. The kilesas don't have to become active. We have the option of accepting or rejecting them. That's where our freedom of will comes in. It comes in at the juncture where feeling conditions craving. When we do that, we start to dismantle paticca samuppada until we reach the cessation of suffering. So let's examine feeling. Feeling is a result of past karma. Feeling is based upon something that we've seen, heard, smelled, tasted, touched, or thought in the past. If we examine it, we'll see that the feeling is just based on a form or a sound, or a smell or a taste, or a contact or a thought. That's all. But because of memory, we then associate that sensation with some past experience. If the experience was pleasant, we like it. If unpleasant, we don't. And because we associate it with something in memory, a reaction takes place. We want it if it's pleasant. We don't want it if it's unpleasant. So when some object is presented to us through any of the senses, which we either like or dislike, we should try to notice the accompanying feeling, the feeling of attraction or repulsion, and how the tendency is to react with either greed or aversion. It is the reaction that's important. The feeling arises down in the heart region, and the reaction arises down there too. But the reaction is often supported by a lot of thinking, which is up in the head. Feelings are results of karma from the past, which is felt as pleasant or unpleasant, good or bad. When pleasant karma comes up, it brings a feeling of I want that, which is triggered by greed. When aversion comes up, it triggers a response of I don't want this feeling, I want to reject it. In trying to reject the feeling, we may think, oh, it was that person's fault, he did it, he caused this unpleasantness. So we make excuses and think critical, angry thoughts. Those angry thoughts are the reaction to the feeling. When angry thoughts come up, they are a form of present karma that tends to bring up the same feeling in the future when something triggers it. So in watching feeling, it is important to pay close attention to the reaction that feelings bring about when something set them off. That's where we can go easily astray. For example, feeling may be set up through the senses. We hear a sound, or we see or smell something, and that will bring up a memory from the past. That past situation comes up in the present as a feeling similar to the one in the past. We then react to that in the same way we did then, thus making the same type of karma which set up the feeling originally. So the wheel goes rolling on, round and round. Usually the contact and the feeling arise so quickly that we have great difficulty in distinguishing them. Contact giving rise to feeling takes place so fast that it is almost impossible to separate them. So it's difficult to see that distinction. But feeling is the important factor to look at. We know that feeling comes from contact. Normally, the contact is automatic. It takes place without any deliberation. Following that contact, feeling arises. It's a resultant process that is caused by consequences of actions done in the past coming up in the present. When that happens, mindfulness should be focused on watching the feeling to make sure that a negative reaction does not take place. In other words, when it's an unpleasant feeling, we tell ourselves, this unpleasantness is my own fault. It's a result of my own karma. I've got to put up with it. We must always avoid blaming someone else. The feeling of aversion is an unpleasant feeling. We must learn to turn inwards and look at that feeling. If we can turn inwards and look at it, we won't let it escape and turn into bad thoughts, so we defeat the kilesas at that point. Mind you, we only defeat them a little bit at a time. To get rid of aversion completely, we'll probably have to do it many times until it gradually goes. To accomplish that, we must look within ourselves to find out where those feelings are, and we must discover what sort of feelings give rise to what sort of mental states. It is very important in meditation practice to look for feeling, to get to know it, particularly feeling in the solar plexus region, because when we're upset in one way or another, it's always felt down there, and it's always there that the kilesas, the defilements, originate. Thoughts, speech, or actions that follow the lead of the defilements create karma. The karma that results will come back to us as feeling in the future, starting the cycle rolling again. When we short-circuit the whole process at the link between feeling and craving, the momentum will slowly lessen and the offending defilements will gradually die away, bit by bit. The benefits won't appear suddenly. Old habits don't die easily, but with persistence over time, they can be reformed. What's important is developing the good habit of being mindful of feelings as they arise and assessing their potential danger to us. It's almost like seeing a red flag come up, warning us to be vigilant. We immediately turn inward then, thinking, I mustn't let this get out of hand. This is a fundamental part of the training in sense restraint. So the way to deal with feelings is not so much a matter of deliberately not reacting to them, but rather one of being mindful of them. When we are mindful, not reacting will take place automatically. Mindfulness is a kind of monitor that checks what's going on without interfering with it. With mindfulness, we sometimes feel like we are standing back and watching the feelings as though from a back seat inside somewhere. Observing from that back seat, we can see clearly what's happening, but we don't interfere in any way. Pleasant and painful feelings are just happening, and that's all. It's that sort of attention that is required. So pay close attention to feelings. When unpleasant feelings arise, examine them at the point where they occur. Don't let those feelings turn into thoughts about blaming others. Think only about the feeling, not other people. In other words, if you keep the mind inside, no harm is done. Trouble comes only when you let it escape out into thought, speech, or action. By allowing the mind to go out and blame things externally, you make karma, and that karma comes back to you in the future in the form of the same sort of feeling. So the wheel just keeps spinning. If you don't learn to correct this recurring cycle, you will never get free from it. To correct it, you must do the right thing by not letting the mind go out. You must focus inward every time to look at those unpleasant feelings and accept them. Accept this is your own fault. Because you have done unwholesome acts, unpleasant feelings arise as a result, so you are to blame for the result. When you accept that it's your fault and don't let your attention go outward, then that debt is paid and your difficulties become a little bit less. Each time you do it, they are reduced. Through that, you find a certain joy and contentment arising within. You feel happy. That happiness is a result of the work you've done, because you have learned how to cure the defilements to some extent. The more you go on in this way, the more you feel buoyant and light. This result points out the right direction. It shows that you are taking the correct path. The more you experience happiness, the more you know that you're headed in the right direction. The kilesas come up because of feeling. Feeling is the goad which arouses them. So if you can put a barrier between the feeling and the craving, you stop the kilesas and they can't become active. By being aware of the kilesas, you can see them when they come up and not react to them. Because they come up in connection with certain feelings, you know that particular feelings are the conditions for the arising of particular kilesas. When that feeling comes up, you know that certain kilesas are lurking in the background. So keep a watch out. Keep the mindfulness strong. If you watch that process, the kilesas don't get a foothold, and the mind naturally calms down and becomes peaceful. Okay, so that's the first section on feeling. And are there any questions or comments that people had?
I'm just curious, how might one balance, like let's say, the sutta on the 5 methods for dealing with a negative mind state, like replacing or distracting, with what Ajahn Pannavaddho is saying about more distant, taking a step back and watching, not interfering.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always like, seeing what works in that situation, because I think especially with the, like the sutta you're describing, like with the 5 ways of dealing with those thoughts, then, the Buddha is kind of pointing to the fact that, there's a variety of different methods that could work, and instead of just always doing one thing. So I think it kind of depends on the situation, and you have to kind of see what works in that situation. Like, particularly for, I think, like the strategy that Ajahn Pannavaddho is talking about, like really being present with the feelings. We do maybe find situations where like the feelings are completely overwhelming, and we feel like if we just try to be present with it, it's not going to actually have a kind of a positive result. So I think that's probably an example of a time where you would maybe try to do something else, like maybe try to replace it.
Thank you for that reading. And the first time I think I heard that this kind of method discussed was during like Goenka retreat, and it made quite a bit of sense. And I also noticed my reactivity decreasing quite a bit after that. And I think I kind of became confused when I started. At a certain point, I was thinking like, oh, maybe that's not right. And then I was switching over to trying to do breathing, like just on a Sati, basically with breathing the full body, I guess. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about those sort of different approaches, I guess. And just open it.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of the same idea as the previous question. Also, is kind of like, just kind of seeing what works, and kind of also talking about like mindfulness of the breathing. Then that's also very much can be part of this technique of also being present with the emotions. It's we talk about being present with the emotions, then it does also have that aspect of trying to learn how to not be moved by them, because it's very possible to be aware of our emotions, but to be completely overwhelmed by them and have them be increasing in power. So that's definitely not not the way to work with it if we see that our defilements are increasing. So I think even though Ajahn Pannavaddho is talking about just being present with the emotions, I think he's kind of assuming or implying that you would be using the breath or using mindfulness of the body to kind of learn how to not be moved by the emotion, how to not be overwhelmed by it.
So feelings, very, because it's referring to like the emotional state, and also like the feelings in the body, like the sensations and vitality and all of those things.
Yeah. I mean, I think it refers to all of them. I think in this chapter he's kind of really maybe focusing on like emotions, but certainly other, I think all of the other kind of physical sensations that we experience would also be included, like heat and cold and things like that. Okay.
And just to clarify some of my understanding too, that feeling, as the Buddha uses it, Veda, feeling tone, generally refers mostly, to the aspect of pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. And, it's a hard word to translate Veda because we use the word feeling to mean many different things in the English language. But physical sensation does have its corresponding feeling tone too, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. But so do mental states, emotions, thoughts. All these constructs will have their corresponding feeling tone. But, like some of the traditions tend to be a little bit tighter with defining it as strictly like tactile sensation, but feeling that has a broader range and just refers primarily to that pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. But the whole question also too of mindfulness of breathing versus mindfulness of feelings, just as Ajahn Sudhiro was saying, the two of them can work together. It's not like a mutually exclusive kind of contemplation. You don't have to do just one or just do the other. You can use the whole mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness of the body to examine the feeling tones as they arise and pass away, and how we react to them and how we don't need to react to them, as Ajahn Sudhiro has been talking about with the reading.
Thank you. Okay, so I can go on to the next section, and not sure if I'll be able to finish all of it, but I'll see how far I can get. Okay, this section is titled Memory. When we were very young and still trying to make sense of the world around us, our minds struggled to absorb all the diverse information that they received through the five senses and to organize it in such a way that we could retain it for future use. We gradually learned to lump similar sorts of things into categories under headings for easy access. Eventually, these general categories began to represent an array of variations on a common theme, referred to by a certain name or word. Take trees, for example. Very early on, we began to recognize shapes of light and color which we could distinguish from other visual forms. We knew they existed, but we didn't know how to tell them apart. Finally, someone pointed out a long brown stem with a green bushy top and called it a tree. They made us repeat the word over and over until the sound stuck in our mind. Pretty soon, the sound of the word tree became a symbol in our mind for all visual images that had a similar shape and color. As we discovered more and more trees in our world, they were all placed under the same iconic symbol, tree. In the same way, we soon learned to distinguish and then recognize all the visual objects in our environment. They, in turn, were all given words to symbolize their unique characteristics. Symbolizing is a way of simplifying. For the most part, it's necessary for the mind to simplify the great variety of incoming sense data. Mental symbols are nature's way to store an enormous amount of information, knowledge, and understanding within a very limited mind capacity. In other words, creating symbols facilitates the task of dealing with a lot of complex information. When we group a large amount of information under one symbol, like tree, we can then deal with just that symbol without the need to consider the totality or the complexity of what it represents. We have a name for it, and that's enough. The complexity can be devilish, but if we can name the devil, we have defeated him. In other words, we have been able to grab a hold of him in some meaningful way. Any object of consciousness is made up of bits and pieces called sankharas that act like pixels on a screen. We don't see the individual pixels. Instead, what we see is a mental object distinct from its background. But the object that we distinguish in this way is, in fact, just a symbol representing the complexity of all the bits and pieces that comprise it. We use such symbols all the time. Our minds are absolutely riddled with them. They're part of the fundamental way we think. We have to use symbols for thinking because the complexity of phenomena is so vast that the mind just isn't capable of holding it all at once. So we focus on certain prominent aspects of every experience and turn those into symbols representing the whole. But these objects are more than just visual images in our lives. They also have a certain emotional impact on us, often associated with the experiences we had in relation to them. Sometimes the experience was positive, sometimes negative, and sometimes neutral. In whichever case, our future perceptions are then colored by an emotional overlay as well. With more time and more experience, the complexity of our perceptions increases. Depending on our emotional state and other conditions, seeing a tree might make us feel happy or frustrated or indifferent. The symbol is still the same, but it has multiple shades of meaning. And because no two individuals are exactly alike in the way they perceive things, the words and symbols that represent those objects may have significantly different meanings from one person to the next. When we are first introduced to a new place, much of what we perceive is unfamiliar. So we begin to look around and observe the general nature of that environment until we can mentally consign the whole of it to a symbol for convenient future reference. It's like putting all of our observations under one heading in a directory. Then we need only access that heading when we want to refer to that place. There will be a word symbol, but there will also be emotional content within ourselves. Creating symbols is essential because it frees memory to be used in all sorts of other ways. Otherwise, if we had to remember everything, our brains would have to be enormous to hold it all. But there's also a fundamental disadvantage to mental symbolizing, because in the end we tend to deal only with the symbols and not with the reality. As a matter of fact, we begin to give the symbols a reality that they don't possess. This can very easily be a cause for more delusion. For instance, we take something very complex like another person and give that person a name. Our notions of that person revolves around the emotional reaction his name tends to evoke. That notion is a very static view of another human being. In truth, the reality of human beings is very complex. We have a general idea of the people we know, but that idea doesn't take into account the changes that are constantly taking place inside them. We have symbols for everything, including our emotional states. When a particular emotional state comes up, we recognize it because we remember it under a certain symbolic heading. It's hard to define these internal symbols. Often they're just feelings, but we know them quite distinctly. That is, we know what the feelings symbolize to us. But that doesn't mean that we know their reality. We often think we understand something, when in truth, instead of catching hold of what's really happening, we've merely caught hold of a symbolic representation of it. What actually happens is invariably quite complex. What's really happening is more like a whirlpool of constant change. If we try to resist change and remain static, we will miss the truth every time. If we can just watch it closely, we will see that everything is part of this whirlpool of changing phenomena. So we let it follow its natural tendency. We should try to be aware that there is a vortex of activity occurring in and around us all the time. We experience this, but because our minds are not quick enough to catch up with the constant arising and ceasing of phenomena, we have to reduce the whole lot to something simple enough for our minds to latch onto. Thus we create a symbol. For instance, a motor car. The word motor car is just a symbol. What is a car actually? It's an assemblage of 100,000 different parts. Nevertheless, we represent it with that one symbol. Similarly, a house is composed of countless bits and pieces. We refer to it as a house because our minds just aren't capable of handling the complexity of what's really there. We just can't hold it all in our minds at the same time, so we have to simplify. The symbols in our minds change and adapt according to circumstances. We have a range of symbols that can adapt to fit different situations. Part of the symbol is the form, part of it is the use, and part of it is the location. Symbols go even further by isolating an object and separating it from the whole of its background. For instance, we identify one tree out of a whole forest. Why do we identify that one particular object as the tree and the rest as the forest? It's just our way of grasping the situation in terms of cause and effect. The same principle applies to internal objects like emotions. We try to get a handle on them by giving them a name. By that token, we think that we understand them. But it is important to realize that the naming and labeling of such things does not truly represent the reality. Internal phenomena like emotional states must be carefully observed. We should always be willing to question them within ourselves. We mustn't simply dismiss them by saying, that's hatred, that's greed. We must look at them as they occur inside. Look at those mental states just the way they are, regardless of what we call them. Try to understand their real nature apart from the name. We should look at the symbols in our minds and try to understand how they distort reality. Being mere symbols, they do not represent the truth. Therefore, they are, in a sense, false. By investigating the symbols, we come to realize that we have views about those mental constructs which we are very attached to. This attachment sets up a tension in the mind based on the possibility that they may fade from memory. Thinking about people and events in the past is a way of refreshing the memory. We do this because we don't want to let go, because we have a lot of attachment to them. I am growing old now, and my memory is not as good as it used to be. I find some advantages in this because the past seems to be rather vague, so I don't think about it much. Because of that, the attachments are dropping away. Having a fading memory is a disadvantage in some ways, but it also has its good points. The symbols we accumulate to structure the world around us are bound up with the faculty of memory. Memory is a database of all our previous experiences that runs like a continuous thread through the pattern of our mental activity. The data from memory comes in through the 5 senses. It's the senses that tell us what to remember. An enormous amount of our thinking is based on memory. When we see or hear something, we identify it by comparing it to remembered impressions. Our present experience may be associated with external sensations, but those sensations have to be identified and interpreted in the light of past sensations. Once we recognize a particular sensation, we think about it, which again relies on the faculty of memory. For that reason, memory is an essential part of all of our perceptions. We can observe how some symbols in our minds tend to fade over time. They may be a little used or outdated. But as soon as they start to disappear, up comes our self-identity, saying, I mustn't let that one go. So we begin to think about it in the process, strengthening and reestablishing it in the mind. We refresh our memories by thinking. Quite a lot of our discursive thought is directed towards that aim. We build up our view of the world from the internal sensations we experience. The impressions we receive are stored in memory. We've accumulated an enormous amount of data, dating back to when we were children. As we grew up, we became very concerned about learning everything we could about our environment, mainly for the sake of our own security in the shifting landscape of life. When we know something and can put a name to it, we find reassurance in that knowledge. If any changes occur in our world, we immediately recognize them and make note of them, because changes may signal imminent danger. We instinctively want to be on top of every deviation from the norm that takes place. In the process, we are constantly updating our memories with fresh information. As new changes occur, old information immediately becomes part of the past. Memory references the past. Because of that, memory itself is the basis of our concept of time. The time that we know is the past. We don't know the future, we predict that. We only predict the future on the basis of what's happened in the past, and we can access the remembered past only by reflecting on it in the present. So we can say that memory is at the center of our views on time. We rely on the past for a sense of security in a changing world. We become very attached to what we remember because it gives a sense of continuity to our lives. It's as though if we can remember something, it still somehow exists. Although we can't actually go back in time, there is comfort in recalling the memory of it. Memories easily become a refuge from the uncertainty of impermanence. But such a refuge is based on neither truth nor stability. We have to accept that nothing is permanent, that everything is constantly changing from one moment to the next, and therefore we should not be deceived into thinking that our memories contain anything in which we can put our trust. Instead of getting caught up in the content of our memories, we should examine the nature of the faculty of memory itself to understand how the process works. Memory is made up of an alphabet soup of images, concepts, and symbols that compare incoming sense data with past experience in an attempt to recognize where it belongs in the inner world of known perceptions. In other words, memory matches present perceptions to past experiences and labels them accordingly. We recognize a tree because we have the characteristics of a generic tree stored in our memory. This in turn is based on a commonly shared interpretation of what that particular form represents. But the designation tree is merely a symbolic substitute for reality, not the reality itself. We suppose that by naming it we understand what it is, but the reality is quite different from the name. When it comes to discussing a topic like meditation, difficulties in communication are bound to arise because we all have our own ideas and our own unique inner experiences. In using language to convey our meaning, we have to turn those concepts into spoken words. Words are sounds that others pick up and turn into meaningful concepts inside themselves. They take the spoken sound, the word, and refer it to memory to find out their own understanding of it. That understanding depends largely on the listener's background. Even with a similar background in Buddhist practice, we can never be sure that any two people will understand a word in the same way. One of the greatest difficulties in explaining mind development to people in the West is that they don't have the advantage of a Buddhist background to help them grasp a basic understanding of common Buddhist terms and concepts. The English language just doesn't have the words needed to properly explain the teaching to them. That is, the words and the concepts for what's being discussed just aren't stored in their memory. Language is necessary for communication, but it is also a minefield for misunderstanding. It's useful to study how language works, how it conveys meaning. Basically, language is a symbolic process. When we think of an object, we are reminded of the word for that object, which has specific connotations attached to it. But the connotations for the same word may differ between the speaker and the listener, which easily causes misinterpretations to arise. The same word, the same symbol, conveys different shades of meaning to different people. When speaking about physical objects in the world, like trees, the differences are unlikely to be a problem. We can point to a tree, but when it comes to concepts like virtue or concentration or wisdom, there's nothing concrete that we can point to. Because of that, it is very easy for people with limited, genuine experience in these matters to misunderstand the meaning of these concepts. Because they've never seen virtue, concentration, and wisdom as objects, most people are bound to develop wrong views about them. When a student is unfamiliar with the terminology, the teacher must carefully explain the path of practice, step by step, and gradually build up an understanding of the basic concepts involved. However, only someone who has really mastered the practice and knows what he's talking about can teach like that. Otherwise, the teacher will be left to explain the practice according to what has been handed down in the Buddhist texts. Because of a lack of profound personal insight into the Dhamma, the teacher is using concepts that he does not fully understand himself, which easily causes misunderstanding to arise in his students as well. When practicing on one's own without a teacher, the Buddhist texts can be a useful reference, but we should not depend on them too much. Following the text as a guide to meditation has its drawbacks because our inexperienced minds are not equipped to unravel their deeper meaning. So we should use the technical terms in the books with caution, as it is very easy to misinterpret their intended meaning. Like any technical subject, for example, engineering, we cannot make use of the technical terms properly unless we understand their meaning relative to the whole subject. The definitions of Buddhist terms developed from ancient times are not the precise types of definitions we are used to seeing in scientific subjects, so they rely even more on a comprehensive view of the practice. Their meanings are more like descriptions that depend on background knowledge from the student in order for him to understand their significance within the context of practical training and self-transformation. They are not concepts that most of us have ready equivalents for in our memory. The only way we can find the full meaning is by experiencing it directly and seeing how it fits in with everything else, like a central piece in a jigsaw puzzle. When that piece fits in snugly all around, then you know what it means in relation to everything else. Similarly, the true meaning of the Buddha's teachings found in the suttas can be very difficult to understand simply by reading and reflecting on the translations available to us. There is no harm in reading the suttas, they are quite inspiring. But we must be careful of the language used in the English translations because the words chosen can be misleading. In most cases, the translations are made by people who do not have a proper understanding based on the practice. Because of that, the translations are not necessarily very accurate. Many aspects of the teachings cannot be understood properly until we have developed an understanding of Dhamma in our own practice. Only then can we realize the various subtleties of meaning implicit in the text. In that case, we may clearly comprehend a profound experience here and now in the present, but the experience may be such that it does not relate to any conceptual symbol we have stored in memory. For that reason, we often cannot verbally explain experiences of profound insight satisfactorily. The language is simply not there. In the Thai forest tradition, this distinction is made between Sanya and Panya. Sanya is traditionally translated as perception. Although that is not entirely incorrect, the best translation of Sanya is memory. Panya is best translated as wisdom. The difference between the two is similar to the difference between appearance and reality, supposition and truth, or intellectual understanding and direct insight. In other words, Sanya is analogous to the intellectual understanding arrived at by thinking, whereas Panya is the direct knowing of essential truths. To give you an example, thoughts are usually formed in words, which are symbols stored in memory. A thought that comes up in words originates from a nucleus or seed of that thought located deep inside. When you trace the thought process back to that original seed, you will find that the entire idea expressed in that thought is contained in the seed. Thinking attempts to express that idea in a dialogue, but on a fundamental level, the idea behind that thought is complete in the seed. Realizing that, you also realize that you know the fully formed idea already, so there's no need to think about it. In fact, thinking about it at length merely dilutes the essence of it and distorts the meaning. Discursive thinking takes appearances, thinks about them, comes to an intellectual understanding, and then supposes that the understanding represents the truth. When we sit down to meditate, our tendency is to try to verify that understanding by searching for evidence of it in our experiences. In other words, our search for the truth is already prejudiced by our suppositions. We expect to find what we suppose to be there. We then interpret our meditation experiences in the light of that expectation. Consequently, our minds are constantly referring present moment experiences to the past, a memory of what should be there, and thus overlooking the true nature of what arises here and now. Because we have figured out in advance the nature of what should take place along the path, we want to check the validity of present moment experience by comparing it to a conceptual understanding already formed in our minds. This is the nature of Sanya: recognition, interpretation, supposition, and it's a big cause of deception. Panya or wisdom is knowing and understanding, but in an active sense, as in the act of knowing or the act of understanding. Although that knowing is usually based on the Buddha's teaching, it does not rely solely on conceptual interpretations learned beforehand to recognize the truth in meditation experiences. A thorough conceptual understanding of the teaching is useful as a background to the wisdom practice, but it should not assert itself as the main player when wisdom's direct, non-conceptual insight is active. As a spiritual training, wisdom shines a light on the nature of present moment reality in an intensely focused way, which allows no time gaps for fact-checking with our intellectual understanding. This is the nature of Panya, cause and effect understanding, grounded in the interaction between present moment conditions. When you start practicing meditation, your mind is out in the world 90% of the time. You have accumulated a storehouse of knowledge about the world around you. You have extensive knowledge of the external world, but you know nothing about what goes on inside your own mind. As you learn how to investigate the nature of your mind to see how it works, you come to the conclusion that your view of the world is fundamentally wrong. You realize that the symbols you have accumulated to structure the world around you are false. That realization comes not from remembered concepts, but from the insights that gradually change your understanding. By using wisdom to analyze and investigate, you will begin to illuminate the true nature of things. The insights that arise from that effort change your overall understanding of Dhamma. As you progress in the practice, you should investigate with wisdom repeatedly until you become skilled in its use. Avoid speculation or conjecture. Don't allow thoughts of what you should be doing or what the results might mean to interfere with your present moment focus. Just concentrate on the truth of what wisdom reveals and let that truth speak for itself. In this way, you can maintain a proper balance between memory and wisdom as you advance stage by stage to the attainment of purity of mind and freedom from suffering. Okay. Okay, are there any last questions or comments that people have on that section? Okay, thank you. Sorry it took a little bit longer than I was anticipating.